The thing about asking for something interesting is that often whatever somebody comes up with, it turns out to be divisive, unpopular, and ultimately niche. Consider the Black Bay P01 that Tudor released in 2019. Tudor pulled something out of their back catalogue and said to the world, we can do something other than the regular Black Bay. The response was more or less unanimous. Please just make another regular Black Bay. And since then, Tudor has pretty much done nothing else except release variations of the Black Bay. And in my mind, the diver's Black Bay, the Pelagos. Longines felt though that it was their turn to try something a little daring and released the Longines Majetek. Again, probably butchering the name, but we'll do our best. The movement in the Majetek is a caliber L893, which is nothing special to write home about. It's a Longines modified version of the ETA 2892 movement with a power reserve upgraded to 72 hours. It's automatic with a small seconds hands. This and variations of this ETA movement are found in quite a number of their models, including the Heritage Classic. Overall, it's a movement based on one of the most respected ETA-based movements. From a quality perspective, I would expect no issues with a movement like this. Some people would expect in this price range that you start to see actual in-house movements like you do in comparably priced Tudor models. Personally, it's not necessarily that important to me, as such as Longines is a part of the larger swatch group within which ETA is housed, and therefore their approach to in-house is going to be different than that of Tudor, who ultimately have to stay within their own brand, albeit I assume sometimes with a little bit of help from their big brother Rolex from time to time. The party feature of this watch is, of course, the unique design. Starting from the outside and working our way in. You have a cushion case with a fluted bezel. You do not see a lot of watches with that combination. Right off the bat, the first concern anybody is going to bring up is the case dimension of 43 millimeters. What? A watch that isn't 40 or 39 or 38 millimeters? Isn't the market going in that direction? Who would release a 43 millimeter watch today? I mean, in 2014, Longines even released the Heritage 1935, which was 1 millimeter smaller. This is a watch that has a lug-to-lug of 51.4 millimeters, which is also on the large side, on paper at least. But here's the thing. The Tissot PRX, which I recently reviewed, is 51.5 millimeters from inflexible bracelet link to inflexible bracelet link. The Nomos Club Datum 42 is 51.5 millimeters. In comparison though, the Speedmaster is 47.2 millimeters and the Sub is around 47.5, 47.6 millimeters. I have no doubt that this watch on a steel bracelet would feel way oversized for many wrists, much like the steel bracelet Panerai. But, like Panerai, because it's on a flexible leather strap and the lugs are short and stubby, it's going to surprise some people on how it wears. It's not average by any stretch of the imagination, but you actually get a watch that isn't as chunky as you might imagine. Next, you have the height of 13.3 millimeters. Now, a Black Bay Pro, as an example, is 14.6. So it's lower than the Black Bay Pro, which everybody had an opinion about, and its thickness. Although it actually feels even lower, and there's two reasons for this. When you have a relatively petite 39 millimeter case like on the Black Bay Pro and a height of 14.6 millimeters, it's going to feel disproportionately high. Lopsided even. Because of the overall size of the case, the 13.3 millimeters seems more balanced and well proportioned. Second, the Black Bay Pro is slab-sided. It's more or less thick, solid vertical wall on the side of the case, whereas the Majetek is two components. It has a relatively thin slab which houses the movement, and then the reasonably thick bezel on top. Because of the thinner movement, the actual case isn't that thick, excluding the bezel, and the two together make for a more interesting profile from the side. It's more characteristic and not as cubistic or bombastic as the slab-sided Black Bay Pro is. It wears thin for a 43 millimeter watch. Again, compared to a Panerai, 44 millimeter Panerai is going to hit you in a Luminor version about 16 millimeters in thickness. So still way thinner than you would expect. The case itself is radially brushed to a reasonably matte degree with a more polished and finished fluted bezel sitting on top of the case. This is a departure from the Heritage 1935, which was polished more or less through and through. I personally agree with this change. The brushed case is more in line with the tool aesthetic and also contributes to slimming down and downsizing the watch, where a pure polish would draw even more attention to the case. The bezel is not a Datejust fluted bezel or a Globemaster fluted bezel. This is a bezel that is reminiscent of the rounded bezels you find on Hanharts. It's a very characteristic look and not in keeping with modern aesthetic sensibilities. The bezel is something that can make a watch look very chunky very quickly. But somehow it doesn't on the Longines. It suits the watch well, and I think that they hit the desired thickness of the bezel really well. Any thicker and it would be an eyesore, and any thinner and the watch would become dainty or even effeminate, which is not in keeping with the tool pilot's watch vibe. And then there's the dial. Compared to the 1935, they've ditched the cathedral hands, going instead for baton hands. The font was all white on the 1935, where they here go for the off-brown aged patina look that I actually thought was going out of fashion. The fonts are significantly smaller, or at least have more space to breathe in the 43mm case, and I think that's part of the reason why they went for the 43mm instead of 42 on the previous version. They've ditched the date indicator, which is a huge positive, and the dial is more muted and matte black. The small seconds is in grey off-white, which makes sure that the overall dial is more harmonious and balanced compared to the quite busy version of the 1935. You can go back and forth about patina and aged looks, but overall the watch actually looks stunning in this configuration. The dial is smaller than you would think, and comparing to a Submariner on the one hand or a Glashütte CQ Green on the other, the Longines comes across as less assuming and more small. Off the wrist, it feels small, but it is a 43mm watch. Just expect to be surprised with how well they have proportioned and balanced this watch. Oh, and the bezel rotates, I don't care. I could have done without that little triangle aesthetically. It's not a thing for me. This leads me to the competition, and you can essentially go three ways when you're thinking about who this watch is for. This could be a watch for people that want a pilot's watch. You know, then you would be comparing it with an IWC or a Stover or a Leica. Your purchasing logic would be based on your love of everything aviation, the storytelling of flight, Beobachtungsuhren and whatnot. Size-wise, it's closer to an IWC Big Pilot 43 than a Mark 20. In the Leica models, it's the Stuttgart or the Karlsruhe or something. Basically variations on simple, low detail dial pilot's watches with either the more common standard dial layout or the more specialized B-Uhr layout. Either way though, what you are going for here is the pilot's watch collector who wants a different kind of pilot's watch with different types of stories. The second buyer is the person that buys a Black Bay P01, whoever that is, or a Deep Sea Challenge. For this person, the choice of this watch is because it simply does not look like other watches out there. It's a, relatively speaking, one-of-a-kind watch for people that go for unusual, not your run-of-the-mill designs. This buyer is looking for the aesthetic conversation piece, the person that wants to be different and signal his or her uniqueness through their clothing and their watch choice. And then there's the aesthetic buyer. This watch is what would happen if you merged a Hanhart and a Panerai, but made it wearable. I mean, look at it. Take the bezel primarily from the Hanhart and throw it on a Panerai. Then you largely have this watch without the trademark sandwich dial of the Panerai. Longines has, in my mind, succeeded in building a wearable Panerai. The Panerai 1314, the one with the green strap, is 44mm thick, 51.6mm lug to lug, and close to 16mm in thickness. Tell me that the Longines is not balanced and more wearable, more interesting, more affordable than a classic Luminor or submersible. This is what Panerai often struggles with. I personally really dig Panerai, and I've had a 683 in my collection, and it was a 42mm Panerai that largely tried much of what the Longines succeeded at. The Longines is a Panerai for a more modern, refined audience. No, it's not 39mm, but it has so much more character than any of the many Black Bays out there. It's got a very cool aesthetic, and no, this is not going to sell in the millions, but it has something, and it's interesting in a not divisive way. It's well executed and worth wearing, which brings me to one more point. Longines is better than Tudor. I may do a full video on this, but I've come to the conclusion that Longines is in many ways more interesting and more daring, dare I say, than Tudor, pun intended. Yes, Tudor gets all the love, but they get it by churning out the one variation of the same dime watch after another. They have tried nothing interesting or daring, which is part of their brand slogan, by the way, since 2019. Their dress watches are forgettable, their watches are nice, but it's a Black Bay in different variations. Now contrast that with Longines. You've got the Hydro Conquest. It's a good-looking diver. You've got the Spirit Zulu Time, a good-looking GMT that stands on its own merits and isn't just a Hydro Conquest with GMT function. You have the Longines Legend Diver. It's a dressy inner bezel dive watch with James Bond Embassy soiree vibes. You have the Longines Heritage Classics, sector dial with a twist that are worth wearing. Heritage Military, a field watch with some serious street cred. And now you have the Majetek, a pilot's watch that is its own and thoroughly well executed. I know I'm sounding like a marketing rep for Longines, but they have some aesthetically very strong propositions in multiple categories. They have the mass market stuff and cater to the niche buyer far better than Tudor does. So if you haven't taken a look at them, I would suggest you do so, because there's some interesting stuff in there. As for the Majetek, you can probably tell I like it. It deserves a lot more customers that it's actually going to get. It is going to be too big for some. It's going to be too special in the look. But personally, I like. Let me know what you think below. Comment, like, subscribe. Cheers.